The crowd was restless, the stadium packed. Reporters from all over the world fought for space on the sidelines, ready to capture this historic moment. Cameras rolling, lights focused. Football was about to witness the rise of its new king. He was just a boy, but he carried the weight of an entire nation on his shoulders. Compared to Pelé, before even turning 15, his name echoed as the next legend of the sport. The eyes of the world were on him, and that night, under the dazzling spotlight of a spectacle seemingly written for a predestined protagonist, he stepped onto the field and silenced all the doubters. Every touch of the ball felt magical, every dribble a masterpiece. The headlines the next day were unanimous. Football had found its new messiah. $1 million contracts were signed, advertising campaigns plastered his face on billboards, and the promise turned into the most hyped story in sports. Suddenly, he was no longer just a player. He was a phenomenon, a brand, a symbol of everything football could become in the future. But while the spotlight shone brightly on him, behind the scenes, something was terribly wrong. The world only saw the surface, the smiling prodigy, donning legendary club jerseys, raking in figures unimaginable for his age. But no one saw the crushing pressure. No one questioned whether he was truly ready to carry a title that even legends took decades to earn. As expectations soared, something unseen and corrosive began to eat away at his path. What no one knew at the time was that a secret was lurking around his name. A single detail that could shatter the entire house of cards built around him. From a guaranteed future to complete obscurity, his career took a turn no one could have predicted. The contracts started disappearing. The clubs that once fought over him began to ignore him. The golden boy of world football started losing his place. And then, suddenly and cruelly, he vanished. How could someone destined for greatness simply disappear from the map? The answer is dark, and worse. It was hidden from the media for years. A scandal so massive that, if revealed at the time, it could have destroyed far more than just his career. What really happened to football's greatest promise? Who was behind the deception? Who profited while he collapsed? Because this isn't just a story about a player who failed. It's about the dangerous machinery of football, where young talents are created, exploited, and discarded with no remorse. And at the center of it all was Freddy Adu, a name once synonymous with greatness, now buried under the weight of broken expectations. From America's next Pelé to a forgotten figure, his rise and fall exposed the darkest side of the sport. But before we reveal the full extent of what went wrong, we need to go back to where it all began. Because the truth behind Freddy Adu's downfall is even more shocking than anyone ever imagined. At just 16 years old, Freddy Adu wasn't just another promising footballer. He was already playing for the U.S. national team, signing $1 million sponsorship deals, and being compared to one of the greatest legends in the history of the sport, Pelé. Imagine being a teenager and having the world watching your every move, expecting nothing less than brilliance every time you touch the ball. Pressure that doesn't even begin to describe it. The comparisons with Pelé weren't just casual remarks by journalists. The media, the MLS, and even his sponsors actively pushed this narrative. They wanted Adu to be a global icon, the face of American soccer, the player who would finally put the United States on the map in the world's most popular sport. And let's be real, he played into it too. He embraced the hype, spoke confidently about his abilities, and didn't shy away from the expectations placed on him. How could he? He was living the dream. But here's where things start to get dangerous. When a player is hyped before proving himself at the highest level, he is not treated like a rising talent. He is treated like a finished product, a superstar who should already be dominating world football. And that's exactly what happened with Freddy Adu. MLS saw him as a marketing goldmine. Instead of allowing him to grow at a natural pace, They pushed him into the spotlight, placed him on every billboard, and made him the poster boy for American soccer. Think about this. At 16, most players are still in youth academies, developing their skills and maturing physically and mentally. Adu, however, was already an international celebrity, expected to carry an entire league on his shoulders. He was given responsibilities that not even seasoned veterans had to deal with. Instead of focusing on his game, he was constantly handling interviews, commercial deals, and media appearances. The league's strategy was clear: make Adu the face of MLS, regardless of whether he was ready or not. Every major news outlet in the US covered his every step, and the narrative was always the same. Freddy Adu was America's first football superstar. They didn't talk about his weaknesses. They didn't allow him to develop quietly. Everything had to be immediate. And if you think about it, this wasn't just MLS's fault. Fans bought into the hype too. Every time he stepped onto the pitch, people expected him to perform like a prime Pelé, forgetting that he was still a teenager learning the game. The expectations weren't just high, they were unrealistic. His early performances showed flashes of brilliance. Quick feet, flair, vision, he had raw talent, there's no denying that. But there was one big problem. He wasn't dominating the way a so-called new Pelé should. He wasn't dribbling past 5 defenders at once. He wasn't scoring hat tricks every game. He wasn't instantly changing matches. And that's when the doubts started creeping in. At first, people ignored it. He's still young, they said. Give him time. But the thing is, time wasn't the luxury Freddy Adu had. He was already at the top, at least in terms of media attention. He had already been sold as a finished product, not a work in progress. So, instead of allowing him to develop at his own pace, the pressure only intensified. Think about how different his situation was compared to real footballing greats. Cristiano Ronaldo, Lionel Messi, even Neymar. None of them had this level of hype before proving themselves on the big stage. They developed naturally, surrounded by world-class teammates and coaching staff. They were allowed to fail, to learn, to adapt. Freddy Adu? He had no room for failure. Every bad game, every poor performance was seen as a disappointment, a failure to live up to the prophecy. And the problem wasn't just the pressure. Tactically, he wasn't being developed the right way. Instead of focusing on improving his weaknesses, his decision-making, his tactical understanding, his defensive contributions, he was being treated like a marketing tool. The MLS wasn't interested in making him the best player he could be. They were interested in making him the biggest name in American soccer. And when you mix extreme pressure, unrealistic expectations, and improper development, the result is always the same disaster. But things were about to get worse. Because while the media was still pushing the Freddy Adu narrative, European clubs were starting to see through the illusion. And when his big move finally came, it wasn't what anyone expected. The media hype surrounding Freddy Adu had reached a level rarely seen in football. It was almost as if the world had collectively decided that this teenager would be a legend before he even had the chance to prove himself. But here's the thing, was he really that good, or was he just a media product, a manufactured superstar designed to sell jerseys and boost ratings? That was the question that started creeping into the minds of coaches, analysts, and even some fans. And once that doubt enters the conversation, it becomes nearly impossible to escape. At first, everyone ignored the warning signs, the flashy highlights, the clever footwork, the glimpses of genius. They were enough to keep the illusion alive. But football isn't just about isolated moments of brilliance. It's about consistency. It's about decision-making, adaptation, tactical awareness, mental strength. And slowly, game after game, it became painfully clear that Adu lacked something crucial. He had technical skill, no doubt. His dribbling was impressive, his close control was sharp, and he had a natural confidence on the ball. But there was something missing, the ability to dominate games. He wasn't dictating the pace, controlling matches, or making game-changing plays regularly. He had flashes of brilliance, but not enough to justify the level of hype surrounding him. And this is where the marketing machine backfired on him. If Adu had been allowed to develop naturally, if he had been treated like any other promising young player, he might have had a completely different career. But the world didn't see him as a promising talent. They saw him as a finished product, a footballing prodigy who was supposed to be delivering greatness immediately. And when that didn't happen, the narrative started to shift. People turned on him. The same media that built him up, that sold him as the next Pelé, began to question everything. They started dissecting his weaknesses, analyzing his performances with a much more critical eye. And suddenly, the golden boy of American soccer didn't seem so golden anymore. His stats didn't back up the hype. He wasn't scoring goals at a remarkable rate. He wasn't providing endless assists. He wasn't carrying his team to victories. He was good, but he wasn't exceptional. And in the brutal world of football, good isn't enough when you've been marketed as a generational talent. And then came the worst part, the doubt from coaches. When a player has talent but lacks consistency, managers start hesitating. They start questioning whether they can really build a team around him. And once that doubt exists, everything changes. Instead of being given chances, you're given tests. Instead of being nurtured, you're judged. And for Freddy Adu, the tests started coming fast. He was moved around different positions. He was dropped from starting lineups. He was given fewer and fewer minutes to prove himself. And the pressure only got worse. Because while Adu was dealing with all of this, the football world was moving forward. New stars were emerging, new young talents were making their mark. And suddenly, the excitement around him began to fade. His biggest problem wasn't just the media hype. It was that football doesn't wait for anyone. Once a player starts showing signs of stagnation, once the hype starts to wear off, clubs start looking for the next big thing. And that's exactly what happened to Freddy Adu. The big European clubs that were once interested in him started losing faith. Scouts who once praised his potential began questioning his long-term future. And the moment that happens in football, your career can take a dramatic turn. And that's exactly what happened to Freddy Adu. He didn't have the luxury of slowly improving in a stable environment. He didn't have time to iron out the flaws in his game while being supported by a system that believed in him. He was expected to be great immediately, and when he wasn't, the football world moved on. But the most frustrating part, the real truth about Freddy Adu's performances, was buried under all the noise. The media made it seem like he was either the next Pelé or a complete fraud. There was no in-between. But the truth is, he wasn't a fraud. He wasn't a joke. He was a talented player who was put in an impossible situation. But football is cruel, and once the hype fades, it's nearly impossible to recover. And for Freddy Adu, the fall from grace was just beginning. Because after the world started doubting him, after the headlines changed from next Pelé to overhyped bust, his career took an even darker turn. And what happened next, that's where the real downfall begins. Before we continue, if you've ever seen a player hyped as the next superstar and then completely disappear, drop his name in the comments. And let me know if you want us to make content about him. Let's see how many forgotten soccer prodigies we can remember. Freddy Adu's career, once painted as the fairy tale of American soccer, was now beginning to show early signs of unraveling. The same media that had built him up as the next Pelé was still pushing the narrative of a superstar in the making, but those who followed his actual performances began noticing something concerning. His development had stalled. At just 16 years old, Adu had already played professional seasons in the MLS, signed a $1 million Nike deal, and even represented the U.S. men's national team. But despite all this, there was one major problem. He wasn't improving at the rate expected of a global superstar. His talent was undeniable. His technical ability, close control, and quick footwork were on full display in moments of brilliance. but the consistency, the tactical awareness, and the physical strength needed to compete at the highest levels were lacking. Coaches began to realize that while Adu was good for his age, he wasn't dominating games the way a future legend should. If he was truly the next Pelé, shouldn't he be outclassing every opponent in the MLS? Instead, his performances were hit or miss, with some matches showing flashes of genius, while in others he completely disappeared. This inconsistency became a growing concern for European clubs that had initially shown interest. Teams in England, Spain, and Italy were curious, but they weren't convinced. While the media made it seem like Europe was desperate to sign Adu, the reality was far different. Scouts and club executives were hesitant. If he was struggling to stand out in the MLS, how would he handle the brutal competitiveness of European football? But the biggest mistake of his career was about to happen. A decision that would send his career into a downward spiral. Adu was desperate to make the jump to Europe, to prove himself on the world's biggest stage. In 2007, he got his move, a transfer to Benfica, one of Portugal's biggest clubs. On the surface, this seemed like the perfect step forward. Benfica was a respected team, playing in European competitions, and had a history of developing top talent. But the transition was anything but smooth. The physicality, the speed, and the tactical discipline required in European football were on another level. Adu, despite all the hype, was not prepared. Training sessions exposed his weaknesses. He struggled with defensive positioning, his off-the-ball movement was poor, and he lacked the endurance needed for the European game. He was no longer a prodigy playing against lesser competition. He was now surrounded by elite professionals, and he wasn't standing out. Benfica quickly realized this, and instead of building the team around him, they benched him. His minutes were limited, and his confidence began to drop. The same player who was once the face of American soccer now found himself on the sidelines, unable to break into Benfica's starting 11. This is where things took a devastating turn. Instead of staying and fighting for his place, Adu started bouncing around on loan after loan after loan. He was sent to Monaco in France, where he barely played. Then to Belenenses back in Portugal, where things didn't improve. Then Eris in Greece, followed by Rizespor in Turkey. Each move was supposed to be a fresh start, but instead, it became clear that he was not progressing as a player. At just 20 years old, the dream was already slipping away. The European clubs that once followed his career with curiosity had now moved on. Adu was no longer seen as the next Pelé. He was seen as a failed wonder kid, another overhyped talent who couldn't live up to expectations. But here's where things get really interesting, because nobody expected what would happen next. A scandal was about to change everything. Something that the media would never tell you. Something that would mark the true downfall of Freddy Adu's career. But before we get into that, let me know in the comments. Do you think Adu was truly overhyped, or did he just make the wrong career choices? Let's see what you think. Since you're enjoying this deep dive, be sure to hit that like button. It really helps bring more stories like this to you. But trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. When Freddy Adu finally made the move to Europe, the expectations were astronomical. The hype machine that had been running at full speed since he was 14 years old was now reaching its peak. This was supposed to be the moment when the world would finally see what he was truly capable of. He wasn't just moving to any club. He was joining Benfica, one of Portugal's biggest and most successful teams. A club with a strong reputation for developing young talent and selling them to the European elite. For Adu, this was the perfect opportunity. He was no longer in the MLS, where the level of competition was still far behind the top leagues. Now, he was in Europe, playing in a team with a rich history, competing in the UEFA Champions League and Europa League, and surrounded by players who had been forged in one of the most competitive footballing environments in the world. This was his chance to prove that he was not just a marketing product, but an actual world-class talent. But right from the beginning, there were problems. Benfica had signed him in 2007, and at just 18 years old, Adu was still young enough to develop, but old enough to make an impact. At least, that was the expectation. What became clear very quickly was that Adu was not ready for European football. The Portuguese league was much faster, more physical, and far more tactically demanding than the MLS. Players didn't just rely on their individual skill. They had to be disciplined, understand the tactical demands of the game, and be able to adapt quickly to different systems. In the MLS, Adu could get away with his natural ability, using his quick feet and creativity to shine in moments of brilliance. But in Europe, those brief moments of skill weren't enough. He had to be consistent, reliable, and fully integrated into the tactical approach of the team. And this was where his problems really started to show. Coaches at Benfica quickly realized that Adu had some serious weaknesses in his game. His positioning was poor. He wasn't making the right decisions in key moments. His work rate off the ball was almost non-existent. He would drift out of games for long periods, expecting the game to come to him instead of actively working to influence it. And worst of all, his physicality was nowhere near the required level. European football, even in a technically gifted league like Portugal's, still required a certain level of physical strength and endurance. Adu, despite his natural ability, was struggling to keep up. The Benfica coaching staff tried to integrate him into the team, but it was clear that he was not on the same level as the other players competing for his position. While others were showing hunger and fighting for their place, Adu seemed lost, overwhelmed by the intensity and tactical demands of the European game. And then came the biggest problem of all. The media started turning on him. For years, the media had built Adu up as the savior of American soccer, the next global superstar. But in football, once the media turns on you, things start to collapse fast. Portuguese newspapers and TV analysts began questioning his performances, and European scouts, who had once been intrigued by his potential, began to lose interest. And this was the moment when Benfica made a crucial decision. Instead of keeping Adu and developing him, they decided he wasn't worth the long-term investment. He was quickly loaned out to AS Monaco in France, in what many saw as a chance for him to regain confidence and prove himself in another league. But instead of improving, his struggles continued. At Monaco, Adu found himself in the exact same situation he faced at Benfica. He wasn't physically dominant enough, he wasn't adapting tactically, and he wasn't performing at a high level consistently. The same cycle repeated. Coaches lost faith, his minutes dropped, and he was eventually sent back to Benfica. From there, things only got worse. Benfica had completely given up on him, and instead of integrating him back into the squad, they sent him on loan again. This time to Belenenses in Portugal, another club where he struggled for minutes. Then to Eris in Greece. Then to Kaker Rizespor in Turkey. Each time, he arrived with the expectation of a fresh start. But each time, it became more and more obvious that he was not going to live up to the potential everyone once believed he had. And this is the moment when European clubs stopped caring about Freddy Adu. At just 20 years old, a player who was once seen as the future of football was now being passed around from club to club, failing to impress at every stop. The European dream was dying right in front of him, and yet there was still a belief, or at least a hope, that he could turn things around. But what happened next was something no one saw coming. A scandal was about to emerge, a story that would raise serious questions about everything people thought they knew about Freddy Adu. But before we get to that, let me know in the comments, do you think Adu's failures were his own fault, or was he simply a victim of the hype? What happens next will completely change the way you look at Freddy Adu's story. Freddy Adu's football career was already on life support, but there was still a lingering belief, however faint, that he could somehow turn things around. After all, he was still young, right? Players go through rough patches, suffer from bad career choices, and struggle with adaptation. Maybe all he needed was one good season, one right club, one coach who could understand his game and give him the confidence he so desperately lacked. But football is ruthless, and patience is a luxury only afforded to those who prove themselves. And Adu? He had run out of chances. But just when people thought his career was simply fading into obscurity, a shocking scandal emerged. One that would permanently tarnish his reputation and make it nearly impossible for him to regain any credibility in professional football. It was no longer just about failing to meet expectations or struggling to adapt to European football. This was different. This was a controversy that raised serious doubts about his entire career, about the very foundations of the hype that had surrounded him since he was a teenager. The biggest question that had quietly followed him for years was suddenly being whispered out loud. Was Freddy Adu actually as young as he claimed to be? For years, rumors had circulated that Adu's real age was not what was listed on official documents. The theory was simple. Many players from certain regions, particularly in Africa, had been accused of falsifying their ages to gain advantages in youth tournaments and professional contracts. Adu, originally from Ghana before moving to the United States, was now being accused of the same thing. If the rumors were true, it would mean that Freddy Adu was several years older than everyone had believed, meaning that his supposed dominance as a 14-year-old playing against grown men might have been a complete illusion. If he was actually 18 when he was claimed to be 14, his rapid decline suddenly made perfect sense. Instead of being a young prodigy who had failed to develop, he would have been just another player who was overhyped based on misleading information. For European clubs, this was the final nail in the coffin. Football is a business, and clubs do not invest in uncertainty. If there was even a small chance that Adu was actually older than advertised, why would any club take a risk on him? If he was truly as young as he claimed, he should have been improving physically and technically like other players his age. But instead, he was declining faster than anyone expected. And once a player is labeled as damaged goods, it becomes nearly impossible to shake off that reputation. But that wasn't the only problem. Freddy Adu had another huge issue, one that had nothing to do with age. By now, many managers had already given up on him, and it wasn't just because of his technical abilities. It was his attitude. Many coaches who worked with Adu later spoke about his lack of discipline, his poor work ethic, and his refusal to adapt to different playing styles. He had spent years being treated like a celebrity, and when the moment came for him to prove himself at the highest level, he expected to be treated the same way. Footballers who succeed at the top level have something in common. They evolve. They adapt. They improve their weaknesses. But Adu? He stayed the same player he had been at 16. His talent never turned into something greater, and he never showed the determination needed to fight for his place. Former coaches even mentioned that he didn't take training seriously and that he lacked the mentality required to compete at the highest level. And in professional football, where teams rely on players who can give 100% in every match, no club wants a player who is unwilling to put in the work. The result? A career full of short stints at clubs that quickly lost interest in him. And when you combine all these factors, the doubts about his age, the lack of development, and the bad attitude, you get a player that no club is willing to take a chance on. The once golden boy of American soccer was now a forgotten figure, drifting from club to club, league to league, each time sinking further into irrelevance. And yet, Freddy Adu still had one final opportunity to prove everyone wrong. One last chance to revive his career and reclaim his reputation. But what happened next would shock everyone. Before we get into that, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the rumors about Freddy Adu's real age? Or do you think he was just a victim of his own hype? Let me know in the comments. While you're enjoying this deep dive, be sure to hit that subscribe button to be the first to hear about the next video that's even better than this one. Freddy Adu's career was spiraling out of control, and everyone could see it. The player who had once been the poster boy for the future of American soccer, who had been compared to Pelé, who had starred in Nike commercials alongside legends, was now drifting further and further away from the elite level of football. His story had gone from that of a rising superstar to a cautionary tale of wasted potential. What was once a fairy tale was now unraveling into something tragic. The sad truth in football is that once a player starts moving down the ranks, it becomes incredibly difficult to climb back up. Every failed transfer, every disappointing season, every underwhelming performance adds another weight, dragging the player further into irrelevance. And that's exactly what was happening to Freddy Adu. After failing to establish himself at Benfica, after struggling at Monaco, after being bounced from loan to loan, it became clear that top European clubs no longer saw him as a player worth investing in. That left only one option: smaller clubs in smaller leagues with lower expectations. Adu was no longer being offered contracts based on his potential. Now, he was desperately searching for any opportunity to keep his career alive. It's a pattern we've seen before with other so-called wonder kids who never lived up to the hype. When the dream of playing for Europe's biggest clubs fades away, the journey into football obscurity begins. First, it's a move to a mid-table team, then a smaller league, then a club fighting relegation. Then, before you even realize it, you're completely out of the footballing spotlight. Adu's journey took him through a carousel of teams, leagues, and countries. France, Greece, Turkey, Serbia, Brazil, Finland, the United States. It was as if he was on a never-ending world tour. Except this was not the journey of a successful international footballer. It was the path of a player who was constantly being discarded, replaced, and forgotten. Each time he arrived at a new club, there was a small glimmer of hope. Maybe this was where he would finally find his footing. Maybe this was where he would prove everyone wrong. Maybe this was the season he would finally live up to the expectations that had followed him since he was a teenager. But each time, the story was the same. He would arrive, be introduced as a high-profile signing, be given a handful of opportunities to impress, and then fade into the background. Coaches lost patience, teammates lost faith, fans lost interest, and just like that, another club would give up on him. In 2010, Adu signed with Aris Thessaloniki in Greece, a club with history, but nowhere near the level of Benfica or Monaco. This was supposed to be his fresh start, a way to get his European career back on track. But once again, he failed to establish himself as a key player. He made only a handful of appearances before being shipped off yet again. Then came a move to Rizespor in Turkey, another step down in competition level. Again, there was excitement when he first arrived. Again, the club promoted him as a big signing. But again, his time there ended in disappointment. The pattern repeated over and over. He would join a new club, and within months, he was either benched or sent away. Instead of proving himself and rebuilding his career, he was becoming a journeyman, a player that clubs took a gamble on before quickly realizing he was not the player they had hoped for. This is one of the most brutal aspects of professional football. Once a player gets labeled as a failure, it becomes nearly impossible to change that perception. Coaches, agents, and club executives talk. When a player gains a reputation for being unreliable, for not working hard enough, for failing to meet expectations, that reputation follows them everywhere. By now, Adu was not only fighting against his own weaknesses as a player, but also against the perception that he was not worth the trouble. And perception matters. When a club signs a player, they want certainty. They want to know that the player will contribute, that he will be a valuable asset. With Adu, there was too much baggage, too many unanswered questions, too much disappointment. And yet, despite all of this, he still found opportunities. But these weren't the kinds of opportunities that a former wonder kid should be getting. These were desperation moves, the last chances that a player gets before the football world forgets about them entirely. In 2013, he made one of the most shocking moves of his career, a transfer to Bahia in Brazil. The idea of an American player going to Brazil was unusual to begin with. But the reality was even worse. Adu barely played. The club, which had initially been excited about signing a player with his level of exposure, quickly realized that he was not going to make an impact. His time in Brazil was over before it even began. Then came trials at clubs that most people had never even heard of. He trained with Blackpool in England, but they didn't sign him. He went to Serbia, but nothing came of it. He even had a stint in Finland, playing for Kuopion Palloseura, but it was just another brief stop on his downward trajectory. By this point, even his most loyal fans had given up hope. The dream of Freddy Adu becoming a world-class player was officially dead. But here's where things get truly surreal. Because even after all of these failures, even after bouncing from club to club, even after proving time and time again that he was not the player people once thought he was, he still wasn't ready to let go. Freddy Adu kept trying. He kept looking for one last opportunity to prove himself. One last chance to show that he wasn't just a failed wonder kid. And that's when things took an even more bizarre turn. Because while his professional career was collapsing, something else was happening behind the scenes. Something that nobody could have predicted. You won't believe what happens next. That's where the story gets truly unbelievable. Freddy Adu's career had been a whirlwind of hype, disappointment, and fleeting hope. By this point, he had played in more leagues than most professionals do in an entire career, jumping from club to club, always looking for the right fit, always hoping for a fresh start, always believing that the next opportunity would be the one that finally put him back on track. But as time went on, reality started setting in. He wasn't the wonder kid anymore. He wasn't the future of football. He was now a player desperately searching for relevance. A player trying to outrun his past failures. A player whose name had become synonymous with wasted potential. And so, in what felt like a full circle moment, Freddy Adu made one last attempt at redemption. He returned to the place where it all began. The United States. The MLS. The league that once hailed him as the face of American soccer. But this wasn't the same MLS that he had left years earlier. When Adu first broke onto the scene, Major League Soccer was still a growing league, still fighting for global recognition, still desperately searching for a superstar to elevate its status. But things had changed. The league had evolved. It had attracted bigger names, better talent, and far more competition. By the time Adu returned, MLS wasn't just looking for hype and marketing appeal. It was looking for real players who could contribute on the pitch. And that was a major problem for him. When he signed with Philadelphia Union in 2011, there was still a small amount of intrigue. Maybe, just maybe, he could still turn things around. Maybe after everything he had been through, after all the failed moves, after all the criticism, he had learned from his mistakes. Maybe this time he would put his head down, work hard, and prove that he still had something left to offer. But the fans weren't buying it. Unlike before, when he was a young star being pushed by Nike and the media, now he was just another player trying to revive a career that most had already given up on. The excitement wasn't there anymore. The belief in his potential was gone. Instead of being treated like a returning hero, he was treated like a gamble that nobody truly expected to pay off. And from the moment he stepped onto the pitch for Philadelphia Union, it became clear that nothing had really changed. He still had flashes of talent, the quick feet, the technical ability, the occasional moment of brilliance. But they were just that, moments, isolated plays that reminded people of the player he once was, but not enough to convince anyone that he was still capable of being a true difference maker. In football, consistency is everything. You can't just have talent. You have to prove it game after game, season after season. Adu couldn't do that. Some games he would look sharp, others he would disappear completely. His fitness was still an issue, his decision-making was still questionable, and his ability to influence matches was nowhere near what was expected of a top-level playmaker. It didn't take long before his minutes started decreasing. Fans became frustrated. Coaches stopped believing in him. The same pattern that had followed him in Europe was now happening in the MLS. He was supposed to be a comeback story, but instead, he was proving his doubters right. By 2013, just 2 years after returning to the league that once made him famous, Philadelphia Union terminated his contract. His time in MLS was officially over. There were no more big clubs waiting for him. No more top-tier leagues interested in his services. The league that once called him the future of American soccer had shut the door on him permanently. And this is where things got even more painful for Adu, because it wasn't just the clubs and the coaches who had lost faith in him. It was the fans, the same people who once cheered for him, who once believed he would lead the U.S. to World Cup glory, had turned their backs on him. By this point, Adu had become a running joke in football circles. Every time his name was mentioned, it wasn't about his talent. It was about how much he had failed. His name became synonymous with overhyped players, failed wonder kids, and wasted potential. Every young American player who showed promise was now compared to Freddy Adu, not as an inspiration, but as a warning. And that's what hurt the most. Because even though Adu was still just in his mid-20s, his career was already considered finished. When a player is labeled as a failure for long enough, it doesn't matter if they still have talent. No one wants to take the risk. No club wants to be the one that gives a player their 10th chance. Adu, to his credit, refused to give up. Even after being let go by Philadelphia, he still tried to find a way back into professional football. He trained with clubs, took trials, tried to convince teams that he could still contribute. But every time he knocked on a door, it was slammed shut. He had gone from being a global football prodigy to a player who couldn't even get a contract in MLS. The league that once built itself around his image no longer wanted anything to do with him. And just like that, the final chapter of Freddy Adu's professional football career was closing. Or at least, that's what everyone thought. Because what if I told you that Freddy Adu still wasn't done? That even after everything, even after being rejected by MLS, after failing in Europe, after spending years bouncing around second-rate leagues, he still had one last, desperate plan to make a comeback? You're not going to believe what he did next. It's one of the strangest twists in football history. Freddy Adu's name, once spoken with excitement and anticipation, had now become nothing more than a distant memory in the world of football. The same media that had once called him the next Pelé no longer cared about where he was, what he was doing, or whether he would ever set foot on a professional pitch again. The endless cycle of hype, disappointment, and failed comebacks had taken its toll, and by the time he was in his late 20s, the reality was undeniable. His career as a professional footballer was over. But what happened next? Where did Freddy Adu go after the cameras stopped following him, after the headlines stopped talking about his latest failed trials, after football clubs around the world had finally given up on the idea that he could still become something special? What does a player do when their entire identity has been built around a dream that never came true? For many ex-players, retirement is a gradual process. Some transition into coaching, others become pundits. Some stay involved with football in some capacity. But for Freddy Adu, the end of his playing days was different. He didn't retire on his own terms. He didn't walk away from the game because he wanted to. Football walked away from him. And that, perhaps, was the hardest pill for him to swallow. Even as the world moved on, Adu still refused to believe that his time was up. He continued training, staying in shape, hoping that the right opportunity would come. But the problem was no longer just about talent, fitness, or finding the right club. By this point, his reputation was completely destroyed. No club wanted to take the risk of signing a player who had become a symbol of wasted potential. No team was willing to bring in someone who had failed at every stop, not because of injuries or bad luck, but because he simply never reached the level he was supposed to. And so, the offers stopped coming. The trials became fewer and fewer. His name disappeared from transfer rumors, from football news, from fan discussions. Freddy Adu was no longer a footballer. He was a forgotten name, a story from the past, what could have been. For years, people speculated about what had happened to him. Some assumed he had retired quietly. Others believed he was still desperately chasing a final chance. But for the first time in his life, Adu had to face a reality he had never considered before: a life without football. So what did he do? Surprisingly, after years of fighting to stay in the game, Freddy Adu did something that no one expected. He stepped into coaching. Not as a head coach for a professional club, not as a high-profile manager, but as a youth academy coach, working with young players who, ironically, were now in the same position he had once been in. It was almost poetic. The player who had been marketed as the greatest young talent of his generation was now teaching kids who dreamed of making it big. Kids who had no idea that the man coaching them was once on the cover of magazines, standing alongside footballing legends. Adu took a role as a youth coach, working with aspiring footballers, helping them develop their technical skills and understanding of the game. It wasn't the glamorous football life he had once imagined for himself, but in some ways, it was the most fitting place for him to be. He had seen everything: the rise, the fall, the pressure, the mistakes, and now he was in a position where he could actually pass on valuable lessons to a new generation of players. But even with this new chapter, Adu never fully let go of the idea of making a comeback. Every now and then, his name would pop up in random footballing discussions, a reminder that he was still around, still hoping, still training. But the harsh reality was that no one in the professional football world was waiting for him anymore. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Freddy Adu reappeared in public. It was an interview years after he had last played, where he finally spoke about his journey, his mistakes, his regrets, and where he stood with football. In the interview, he was candid, admitting that he didn't make the right choices, that he never worked as hard as he should have, that he let the pressure and hype distract him from what really mattered. For the first time, Freddy Adu wasn't speaking as a football prodigy or as a player trying to sell the idea of a comeback. He was speaking as someone who had finally come to terms with his story. It was almost surreal to watch. The once cocky, confident young player who had been in commercials with Pelé and signed million-dollar contracts before he was old enough to drive was now just another former athlete, looking back on a career that never lived up to expectations. But here's the real question: was Freddy Adu a failure? Was he a victim of the media machine that built him up too fast? Or was he simply not good enough? Should we blame his poor decision-making, his work ethic, his attitude? Or should we look at the bigger picture? The way football treats young talents, the way hype can destroy a player before they even get a real chance to prove themselves? Even though he never reached the heights people expected, Freddy Adu's story is still one of the most fascinating in football history, because his name still gets mentioned, people still talk about him, and he remains the ultimate example of how a career can spiral out of control. But here's where things get interesting, because even now, Freddy Adu refuses to fully walk away from football. And if you think his story is over, you might want to stick around, because what happens next, that's something you won't believe. Before we get into that, I want to hear from you. Do you think Freddy Adu's career was doomed from the start, or did he have a real chance to succeed? Let me know in the comments, because trust me, there's still more to this story than you think. Freddy Adu's story is one that football fans still debate to this day. How does a player go from being the most hyped young talent in American history to a forgotten name, bouncing from club to club, league to league, desperately searching for one last chance? Was he truly a victim of a system that builds up young players only to destroy them? Or was he simply a case of a player who was never good enough to begin with? For years, the media sold us a dream. A 14-year-old prodigy who was destined to change football forever. A player who was so talented that he had to turn professional before he even finished high school. A superstar in the making who would dominate the game for years to come. But here's what the media never told you. Freddy Adu was never given a chance to fail naturally. In football, development is everything. Even the most gifted young players in history, Lionel Messi, Cristiano Ronaldo, Neymar, Kylian Mbappe, were given time to grow, to learn, to make mistakes without the entire world watching. When Messi arrived at Barcelona, he wasn't expected to be the best player in the world at 16. He was slowly integrated into the team, given support, allowed to adapt. When Ronaldo first arrived at Manchester United, he was raw, inconsistent, sometimes frustrating to watch, but he was coached, developed, and given time to refine his game. Freddy Adu never had that. From the moment he turned professional, the pressure on him was unbearable. He wasn't just a promising young talent. He was a marketing product, a symbol for American soccer, a player who was supposed to carry an entire nation's hopes on his back. Every move he made was watched. Every game he played was analyzed. Every mistake he made was magnified. Instead of being a young footballer trying to learn, he was treated like a fully formed superstar who was expected to dominate from day one. And that's where the system failed him. In Europe, young players are protected. They develop in elite youth academies, learning tactics, improving their weaknesses, preparing for the demands of professional football. But in the United States, the football system was still in its infancy. There was no proper structure to develop a talent like Freddy Adu. Instead of playing in a competitive youth league, instead of being coached by the best tactical minds in the sport, he was thrown into the MLS at 14 years old, playing against grown men, expected to be the best player on the field. That's not how football works. Talent alone is never enough. Football is about more than just quick feet and flashy dribbles. It's about tactical intelligence, decision-making, positioning, endurance, adaptability. These are things that players learn over time, through proper coaching and experience at the highest level. Adu never had that development, and here's a part that no one talks about. The media had already decided his fate before he ever had a chance to prove himself. When he struggled in MLS, instead of being treated like a young player learning his craft, he was criticized. When he moved to Europe and failed to make an immediate impact, he was labeled a flop. No one stopped to consider that he was just a kid who needed time. No one stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, he was a player who had potential, but was simply being rushed into an impossible situation. And that brings us to the biggest question of all. Was Freddy Adu ever truly good enough? This is where opinions start to divide. Some say that he was never a world-class talent, that he was simply a player with good technical ability, but lacking the physical attributes, tactical intelligence, and mental strength needed to succeed at the highest level. Others believe that he could have been great if he had been developed the right way, if he had been given the same treatment as young stars in Europe, if he had been placed in a system that nurtured his talent instead of exploiting it for marketing and publicity. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Freddy Adu was not Pelé, and he was never going to be. But was he good enough to have had a successful career in top-level football? Possibly. With the right coaching, the right environment, and the right mentality, he could have been a solid player in Europe, maybe even an important player for the US national team. But that never happened. And what's even more tragic is that his story has now become a warning for future young players. Every time a young footballer is hyped up too soon, people say the same thing. Be careful, you don't want to end up like Freddy Adu. His name is now used as a symbol of wasted potential, of what happens when a young talent is mishandled, of how football can be ruthless to those who don't develop properly. His story changed the way people view young prodigies. Clubs and agents started being more cautious about overhyping young players. Coaches became more focused on development rather than immediate results. Football learned a lesson from Freddy Adu's downfall. But the sad thing is, Adu himself paid the price for that lesson. And here's where things get even crazier, because even after everything, even after being out of professional football, even after being written off by everyone, he still wasn't ready to give up. Because what if I told you that Freddy Adu still believed he could make a final comeback? What if I told you that, despite everything that had happened, he still had one last twist in his story? Freddy Adu's story is one that will forever be remembered, not for what he achieved, but for what he could have been. His career was not just a personal tragedy, but a lesson for an entire generation of footballers. A case study in overhyped mismanagement and the brutal realities of professional football. A name that will always be associated with wasted potential, not because he lacked talent, but because his path was never truly about football. It was about selling a dream that was never built on reality. Could he have been great? That's a question that will forever spark debate among football fans, coaches, and analysts. Did he have enough raw talent to make it? Or was he always just a marketing product, a player whose reputation was built more on headlines than on ability? Some believe that he had the skills but was thrown into the deep end too early, without the proper development, without the right coaching, without the patience that other young stars were given. Others argue that he was never destined for the top, that his game lacked the attributes required to succeed at the highest level, that the idea of him being a world-class player was always just an illusion. But regardless of where you stand on the debate, one thing is undeniable. Freddy Adu's career changed football forever. His story became a cautionary tale, a warning to clubs, agents, and young players about the dangers of premature hype. Before Adu, the idea of turning a 14-year-old into a global superstar was seen as exciting, revolutionary, a way to fast-track a young talent into greatness. After Adu, clubs became far more cautious about overexposing young players too soon. They started emphasizing development over instant stardom, allowing their best prospects to grow in controlled environments, away from the overwhelming pressure of media and sponsorship deals. This is why, in many ways, Adu's story is one of legacy, not failure. He may not have become the legend people expected, but his experience shaped how football treats young talent today. When you look at players like Kylian Mbappe, Erling Haaland, and Jude Bellingham, you see athletes who were protected, carefully guided, and developed in the right way. Because the world saw what happened to Adu when those things were ignored. But then, there's another angle to this story. The curse of being compared to Pelé. How many players have been called the next Pelé, only for their careers to crumble under the weight of those words? Freddy Adu was not the first to be given that label, and he certainly won't be the last. Over the years, we've seen so many promising young footballers be crushed under the expectations that come with being compared to one of the greatest players of all time. There was Nee Lamptey, the Ghanaian wonder kid, who was once considered a prodigy, but whose career was destroyed by bad transfers and personal struggles. There was Robinho, the Brazilian who was supposed to carry the legacy of Pelé at Santos, but never lived up to his potential in Europe. There was Alexander Pato, a player with world-class ability, but who could never stay fit long enough to dominate. And then, of course, there was Freddy Adu, the American prodigy who was never allowed to develop like a normal player, whose career was dictated by media narratives rather than footballing reality, who never had the structure, the patience, or the right environment to truly become the player he could have been. It makes you wonder, is being compared to a legend the worst thing that can happen to a young player? Instead of allowing them to carve out their own paths, these comparisons create unrealistic expectations, forcing them to live up to impossible standards before they've even proven themselves. But Freddy Adu's story isn't just about football. It's about life, about pressure, about what happens when potential is mishandled. His career teaches us that talent alone is never enough. You need the right guidance, the right mentality, and the right circumstances to succeed. It shows us that football is ruthless, that the game will build you up just to tear you down, that the same media that hypes you today will be the first to call you a failure tomorrow. But perhaps the biggest lesson in all of this is that football moves on. No matter how big the hype, no matter how bright the spotlight, the game doesn't wait for anyone. If you don't evolve, if you don't grow, if you don't prove yourself, you are forgotten. And that's exactly what happened to Freddy Adu. But here's the crazy part. He wasn't the only one. Because if you think Adu's story is tragic, wait until you hear about the next player we're going to talk about. Another footballer who is compared to a legend. Another talent who is supposed to be one of the best in the world, but whose career took an even darker turn. This one might be even more shocking than Adu's story. So subscribe to the channel now. Click on the video that is appearing on the screen now and get ready for an even more unbelievable story. You won't believe what happened to this player.